On a Saturday morning in March of 1994, Vera Stinson walked into a farm auction in Randolph County, Illinois, and bought a dead woman's sewing room for $80. The auctioneer had listed it that way in the weekly shopper that got left on the counter at every feed store and diner in the county. Sewing contents, miscellaneous notions and equipment, $80 takes all. No individual items. No description of what miscellaneous meant. Just a line in a paper that most people skipped over on their way to the farm machinery listings, which were the reason most people came to Randolph County auctions in March, when the ground was still too frozen to work and there was nothing else to do but spend money on equipment you didn't need yet. Most people. Let me tell you about Randolph County in March of 1994, because you need to understand the world Vera was walking into before you can understand what she saw sitting on that folding table in a dead woman's back room. This was river country, the kind that sits quiet between the bluffs above the Mississippi and the flat cash crop fields that stretch east toward the center of the state. The towns were small and getting smaller, the way towns go in that part of the country when the young people leave and the old people stay, and then the old people stop staying too. Every farmhouse had a room the family called the sewing room, the way every farmhouse had a room called the sitting room, whether anyone sat in it or not. The sewing room was usually where the woman of the house had spent her hours that were her own, which in farm life were not many and were therefore used with intention. The woman whose room this had been was named Bertie Krause. She was 79 years old when she died in February of that year, and she had lived on the same 40-acre property outside Sparta for 51 years. Her husband Laverne had died in 1986. Their son Raymond lived in Memphis and worked for a shipping company, and had come back for the funeral and stayed 4 days and hired a local auctioneer named Cal Prentice to settle the estate before he flew home, because Raymond Cruz had a life in Memphis, and the 40 acres outside Sparta did not fit into it. Cal Prentice had walked through Bertie's sewing room for about 8 minutes. He'd seen a sewing machine which was old and which he'd priced separately at $40, because even he knew old sewing machines sold. He'd seen 3 cardboard boxes of fabric. He'd seen some wooden spools and a coffee can full of buttons, and 2 large flat drawers that he'd pulled open and looked at without knowing what he was looking at, and then closed again. He'd seen a wooden cabinet the size of a small dresser that had been locked, and when Raymond found the key and opened it, Cal had looked inside and seen more of the same. Small metal things in paper envelopes, paper patterns folded into yellowed tissue, tools with names he didn't know, and he'd written $80 in his notebook and moved on to the kitchen. That's not what Vera saw. Let me tell you about Vera Stinson, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she did when she walked into that room. Vera was 51 years old in 1994. She had grown up in Chester, 12 miles up the river, the daughter of a tailor named August Stinson, who had operated a small alterations and custom shop above a hardware store on the main street for 34 years. August had not been a famous man. He had not been a wealthy man. He had been a precise man, which in his trade was the same thing as being a good man, and he had spent every Sunday afternoon of Vera's childhood at the kitchen table with his daughters, teaching them to read cloth and thread and needle the way other fathers taught their children to read maps or box scores. August had a thing he said about needlework tools that he stated without drama and without decoration. He said that a good tool in the hands of someone who understood it was not a luxury. He said it was a form of accuracy, and that accuracy was the only thing that separated work that lasted from work that didn't. He said the difference between a fine needle and a cheap needle was not the price on the packet. It was the truth of the hole it made. Vera had grown up with this, the way children grow up with the things their parents say so often, they stop hearing the words and start living the meaning. By 1994, Vera had been doing custom embroidery and textile restoration for 22 years, not in a shop, at home. At a long table in the south-facing room of the house she shared with her husband, Dale, on a gravel road outside Chester. She restored baptismal gowns and wedding linens, and the kind of old quilts that families brought to her wrapped in pillowcases because they were afraid of them, because they were old and fragile and had belonged to someone who had mattered. She charged what the work cost her in time and what the materials cost her to replace, and not much more than that because the work itself was the point. She had also, over those 22 years, developed a knowledge of textile tools that was specific and deep and almost entirely invisible to the people around her. She had read every trade catalog she could find, written to manufacturers in England and Germany and France, corresponded with the curators of 2 textile museum collections, and with a small group of collectors scattered across the Midwest who cared about the same things she cared about. She could identify the maker of a needle by the finish of its eye. She could look at a pair of embroidery scissors and tell you the country of origin and the approximate decade from the shape of the bow and the grind of the blade. She could pick up a thimble and tell you whether it was English, German, or American, and whether it had been made for a professional or a domestic market, and what that distinction said about the woman who had owned it. She had never said any of this publicly. She had never been asked. Cal Prentice certainly hadn't asked. Now let me tell you about Cal Prentice, because you need to understand the man who priced that room at $80. Cal was 46 in 1994, and he'd been running farm auctions and estate sales in Randolph County for 14 years. He was competent in the way that people become competent when their job requires them to know many things generally and nothing specifically. He knew farm equipment. He knew kitchen appliances, roughly. He knew furniture, if it was the kind of furniture that appeared in every sale, which most of it was. He was a man who moved quickly through the contents of a life and arrived at a number and wrote it down and stood behind it, and he was rarely wrong enough that anyone complained. He'd looked at Bertie Krause's sewing room, without knowing that what he was looking at required a different kind of looking than he knew how to do. He hadn't known that the locked wooden cabinet was a tool cabinet, not a sewing cabinet. He hadn't known that the flat drawers held what they held, He hadn't known that there was a difference between the buttons in the coffee can and the other buttons in the small hinged box on the second shelf. And he hadn't looked closely enough to wonder. $80 was a fair number for a room full of fabric and notions and an old machine. That's what he'd seen. Vera had read Cal's listing on a Friday evening and had set down the shopper on the kitchen table and sat without moving for a moment the way she did when something required her to think before she spoke. Then she'd called her friend Margaret Sowell, who was the only other person in the county who might have understood the specific thing Vera was thinking, and she'd read the listing aloud over the phone. Are you going? Vera said Saturday. You want me to come? Vera said no. She drove to the cruise place on Saturday morning and arrived 30 minutes before the sale opened and waited in her car at the end of the lane. One other vehicle was already there, a truck with 2 men who walked directly to the outbuildings and never looked at the house. A station wagon arrived a few minutes later. The woman who got out went straight to the furniture staged on the lawn and didn't look twice at the back door. When Cal Prentice unlocked the house at 9, Vera was the first one through, and she walked directly to the sewing room. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then she stepped inside and stood still. Let me tell you about what was in that room, because this is why the story is still told the way it is. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12, with a north window and a south window, and the particular smell of old textile work, which is cotton and lanolin, and a faint trace of something metallic that Vera had known since childhood. The sewing machine was a treadle model, older than Cal had likely realized, but Vera wasn't here for the machine. She was here for the cabinet. The wooden cabinet stood against the east wall. Raymond had left it unlocked after Cal's walkthrough, and the key was sitting in the lock, which told Vera that nobody had thought the cabinet worth securing. She opened it. The top shelf held 3 pincushions, but the pincushions were not pincushions in the ordinary sense. They were the kind of weighted, fitted, professional cushions that came with a specific class of needlework tools, and they held needles that Vera had to look at twice, not because she was uncertain what they were, but because finding them in a farm widow's cabinet in Randolph County, Illinois, was not something she had expected. They were John James tapestry needles, which was not remarkable in itself. What was remarkable was that they appeared to be pre-war, from the period before the English manufacturer changed its grinding process, and they were still in their original foil and had never been opened. She looked at the second shelf. There was a small leather wallet, the kind that closes with a snap. She opened it carefully. Inside were scissors, 4 pairs nested in fitted leather loops. German, she thought immediately, and then she leaned close to the smallest pair and read the mark on the inside of the bow, and she felt her hands go still at her sides. They were Premax, not the modern Premax. The original firm, the Florentine manufacturer that had supplied professional embroiderers in Europe before and just after the First World War, and that had been absorbed by a larger company in the 1930s. The mark was the old one she'd seen in photographs and in a catalog plate that a curator in Chicago had mailed her 3 years ago. She had never seen an original pair in person. She looked at the flat drawers. The first drawer held thimbles, not a random collection, a fitted collection organized by size in a shallow tray lined with what had once been blue velvet and was now a faded gray blue. There were 14 of them. She checked the marks on 6 before she stopped checking, because she had understood by then that she was looking at a complete set of Dreyfus professional thimbles, German, pre-war in every working size, and that a complete Dreyfus set in this condition was something that the collector she corresponded with in Cincinnati had told her 2 years ago he had been trying to locate for 11 years. The second flat drawer held thread, not spools, skeins, small, labeled, wound with a tightness that indicated professional storage. She looked at the labels and recognized the manufacturer from a French catalog she'd found at an estate sale in St. Louis 8 years earlier and had bought for 50 cents because no one else knew what it was. And then there was the box. On the bottom shelf of the cabinet, pushed toward the back, was a flat wooden box about the size of a hardcover book. The wood was walnut. The joints were dovetailed. She lifted it out carefully and set it on the table by the window and opened the lid. Inside, in a fitted interior with separate recesses for each piece, was a set of transfer tools, styluses of various thicknesses and a small handled wheel with interchangeable points in a paper sleeve, and a set of templates in thin brass that had been cut by hand, not stamped. She turned one over and read the maker's mark on the back and sat down on the edge of a wooden chair that was the only other seat in the room. The mark was a name she knew from a single reference. An Austrian instrument maker who had operated in Vienna between approximately 1895 and 1922, and whose tools had been used by a small number of professional embroiderers and lace makers in Central Europe during that period, and whose work was now almost entirely unlocated. The curator at the Chicago Textile Museum had told her that she was aware of 2 intact sets in institutional collections in Europe and none in private hands in North America. Vera sat with the box in her lap for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked to the table where Cal Prentice was standing with his clipboard and said, "I'll take the sewing room contents." Dollars. Cal looked at her. 80 takes all of it, the way it's listed. Dollars, I know, Vera said. I'll take it. Dollars. Cal wrote it down and took her check. That was the whole transaction, $80. Dollars. Vera spent 3 hours packing the room. She had brought flat boxes and tissue paper and small cloth bags, and she packed each piece the way her father had taught her to pack fine things, which was as if they were going to be in the box forever, and also as if they were going to be opened tomorrow by someone who needed to find them exactly as they'd been left. Dollars. By the time she was done, the station wagon woman had bought a bedroom set and gone home, and the men with the truck had loaded a hay rake and a disc harrow and left, and Cal Prentice was in the kitchen talking to Raymond Cruz on the phone, and Vera was still in the sewing room, wrapping the last of Bertie's thimbles in squares of cotton batting. Dollars. Cal came to the door as she was carrying out the final box. He looked at the careful stacks in the back of her sedan and said, "You know what any of that's worth?" Dollars. Vera said, "Some of it." Dollars. Cal nodded. "Old stuff," he said. "You never know what someone will want." Dollars. He went back inside. Dollars. Vera sat in her car for a minute before starting the engine. Then she drove home. Dollars. Now let me pause and ask you something. What did Cal Prentice believe he had sold that morning? Dollars. He believed he had cleared a sewing room at a fair price, which was the price he'd set, which was the price the buyer had paid without negotiating, which was exactly how these things were supposed to go. He had no reason to feel that anything had gone wrong. He'd assessed the room. He'd priced it. The transaction had been clean. Dollars. The transaction had also left something in the range of $22,000 in a locked cabinet in a dead woman's back room in Randolph County, Illinois, and handed it to the one person in the county who understood what was inside. Dollars. Let me tell you about what Vera found when she got everything home and began working through it properly, because the inventory she assembled over the following 2 weeks is the reason the story matters. Dollars. She worked the way her father had worked, which was methodically and without hurrying. She set each piece on her work table under the daylight lamp she used for restoration work and examined it carefully, checking marks and finishes and construction details and consulting the reference materials she'd assembled over 2 decades of correspondence and searching and the occasional small purchase that had felt extravagant at the time. Dollars. The Premax scissors were exactly what she'd thought. The Florence mark, the pre-merger grinding, the specific profile of the smallest pair that corresponded to the catalog photograph she'd been given. The leather wallet itself was original to the set, which was rare, because the wallets went before the scissors did. She sat with the smallest pair for a long time. Dollars. The Dreyfus thimbles were complete. She verified each size against the notation in a collector's guide she'd received photocopied in the mail from a woman in Ontario who had since died, and which was one of perhaps 50 copies in existence. Complete Dreyfus sets in working condition came up at auction once or twice a decade, the collector in Cincinnati had told her, and the last one had sold in 1989 for $4,400. The French thread was what she had suspected. The manufacture had operated from approximately 1908 to 1938 and had supplied professional embroiderers and atelier houses in Paris and Lyon during the period when French decorative textile work was, in the estimation of people who knew about such things, at its highest technical point. The color labels were intact on every skein. The thread was still pliable. She had no way to know how Bertie Cruz had come to own it, which was a question she found herself turning over for days without being able to answer. The Austrian transfer set she left for last, the same way you leave the thing you're most certain about for last because the certainty itself is a thing extended. She spent 3 evenings with it, consulting every reference she had and writing 2 letters, one to the curator in Chicago and one to a collector in Toronto, describing what she was holding without stating her conclusion, dollars, asking whether her reading of the maker's mark was consistent with what they knew. Dollars. Both wrote back within a week. Both said yes. Dollars. She wrote the estimated value in her workbook, looked at it for a moment, and then closed the book and went to make dinner. She didn't call Margaret that night. She didn't call anyone. Dollars. She sat at the kitchen table after dinner and thought about Bertie Krause, a woman she had never met, and about how a woman could spend 50 years on a farm in Randolph County and maintain a cabinet of professional-grade European embroidery tools of this quality in this condition and die with a son in Memphis who had no idea what was in the locked room. Dollars. She thought about what her father had said about accuracy being the thing that separated work that lasted from work that didn't. She thought about Bertie Krause's thread, still pliable after 50 years in a drawer, dollars, and about what that kind of care said about the person who had kept it that way, dollars. She thought about what it meant to have that kind of knowledge and keep it that quietly, and then leave it behind in a room that a man with a clipboard had looked at for 8 minutes. Dollars. The total conservative value of the contents Vera Stinson had purchased for $80 was, after 2 months of correspondence and one conversation with a dealer in fine textile antiques in St. Louis, dollars, somewhere between $19,000 and $23,000. That was 1994 money, dollars. That was based on comparable auction results and on the dealer's assessment and on what the collector in Cincinnati said he would offer for the Dreyfus set alone. $19,000 to $23,000 for $80. Now let me tell you about what Vera did with that information, because this is where people who hear the story tend to get it wrong. She did not sell the transfer set. Not then. Not for a long time. She used it the same way she believed Bertie Krause had used it, carefully and with an understanding of what the tools could do that most embroiderers, even serious ones, didn't have. The transfer tools allowed a precision of pattern placement that changed the quality of her restoration work in ways her clients noticed without knowing why. Several of them asked her, in the years that followed, whether she had changed her method. She said she had access to better instruments. That was true. She sold the thread through the dealer in St. Louis, skein by skein, over the course of a year, to buyers who were using it rather than collecting it, which was what she wanted, The money she received from those sales she spent on 2 things: a proper light table for her restoration work that she had been putting off buying for 4 years, and a trip to a textile museum in Pennsylvania that she had been told about and had never been able to justify the cost of going to see. She told Margaret about it eventually, about 4 months after the sale, at Margaret's kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. She told it plainly, without drama, the way you tell a thing you've thought about so many times it no longer surprises you. Margaret listened and then said, "What did Prentice say when he found out?" Vera said, "I don't know that he found out." Margaret said, "Do you think he'd want to know?" Vera thought about it. "I think he'd want to have priced it differently," she said. "I'm not sure he'd want to know why he couldn't." Cal Prentice did find out. It was about a year later, at a church rummage sale in Sparta, where they both happened to be, and someone who'd heard the story third hand raised it in the particular way that people raise things they know will cause discomfort, which is to act as though they're doing everyone a favor by bringing it up. Cal heard the general outline of what the Krause sewing room had contained and what Vera had paid for it, and his face went through a series of expressions before settling on something neutral and controlled. He looked at Vera and said, "You knew what was in there when you wrote the check." Vera said, "I had a pretty good idea." Cal said, "You could have said something." Vera looked at him for a moment. "You listed it," she said. "That was your job. I paid the price. That was mine." Cal Prentice didn't have an answer for that. He stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets and then said he needed to look at something across the room, and Vera watched him go and then went back to looking at a box of old buttons that someone had priced at $1 and that she was fairly certain contained, at the bottom, a set of carved horn buttons from a period and a manufacturer she had written about once in a letter to the Ontario collector. Dollars. She bought the box for $1. She was right about the buttons. Dollars. Now let me pause here, because this is the moment the story asks something of you, and it's worth pausing. Dollars. Was Vera wrong? Dollars. She had paid what Cal Prentice asked. She had not misrepresented herself or the tools or the transaction. She had not deceived Bertie Cruz's son, who had received the price the auctioneer had set, dollars, which was the price the auctioneer believed was correct, which was the system working exactly as designed, dollars. Vera had simply brought to that room a quality of attention that the system did not require and did not reward and had no mechanism to account for. Dollars. The question the story turns on is not whether Vera was wrong. The question is what it means that the same locked cabinet could be worth $80 to one person and $22,000 to another, and what that gap represents, and whether anyone is responsible for it. Dollars. Vera's answer, which she never stated as a position but which her actions made plain, was that the gap was knowledge, and that knowledge was the result of a lifetime of specific attention, and that the value of that attention was the gap itself. Dollars. Let me tell you about what happened to the Austrian transfer set, because this is the thread that runs through the rest of the story. Dollars. Vera used the transfer tools for 11 years. She used them in her restoration work and in the few original pieces she made during that period for clients who trusted her judgment about what a piece should look like. Dollars. The quality of placement that the tools allowed changed what was possible for her in ways that she found difficult to describe to people who hadn't worked at that level. Dollars. But the pieces themselves demonstrated clearly to anyone who knew how to look. Dollars. In 2005, Vera's daughter Lena, who was 28 years old and had grown up watching her mother work at the long table in the south-facing room, asked her about the transfer tools, not about their origin, but about the specific thing they did that her mother's previous tools had not done. Dollars. Vera thought about the question. Then she said, "They hold the line where you put it. Most tools move the line a little, these don't." Dollars. Lena understood what that meant. She had grown up in the south-facing room the way Vera had grown up at August's table, absorbing something that had no formal name but that organized itself in the hands as a kind of precision, an understanding that good work was the product of good tools used by someone who understood them, and that both conditions had to be present. Dollars. Lena was not a textile restorer. She had become a conservator at a regional museum in Evansville, which was a different application of the same underlying relationship to old-made things. But she understood tools the way her mother understood them, which was as a form of frozen accuracy waiting for the right hands. Dollars. She had started going to estate sales with Vera that year. Dollars. Let me tell you about what Lena found at a sale in White County, Indiana, in the fall of 2007, because the story doesn't end with Vera. Dollars. The sale was at a farmhouse outside Manon. Dollars. The estate of a woman named Cora Tibbett, who had worked for 40 years as a professional dressmaker in a shop in Monticello, and who had retired to the farmhouse in 1990 and died at 82. Dollars. The family had hired an auctioneer. The auctioneer had done what Cal Prentice had done, dollars, which was look at a room full of professional dressmaking equipment and see a room full of old sewing things and price it accordingly. Dollars. There was a wooden workbox, shallow and flat, priced at $15 because it was old and the hinges were tarnished. Lena opened it. She looked at her mother. Dollars. Vera looked at the contents. She looked at the workbox itself. She looked at the maker's stamp on the underside of the lid, which was faint but readable, and which she recognized without hesitation. Dollars. The workbox had been made by a firm in Sheffield that had produced professional dressmaking and tailoring tool cases for the English market from approximately 1880 to 1935. The firm's cases showed up rarely at auction and almost never in the Midwest, because the women who had owned them had generally not come from the Midwest. Someone had brought this one from somewhere else, and it had ended up in a farmhouse in White County, Indiana, priced at $15 by a man who had not known what he was holding. The interior was fitted. The tools inside it were intact. Lena looked at the auctioneer, who was across the room talking to a man about a chest freezer. She bought the workbox for $15. And when the auctioneer later asked her if she knew what it was, she gave him the same answer her mother had given Cal Prentice. She said, "I paid $15 for it." Now let me tell you about what happened in the spring of 2011, because this is where the story finds its shape. By 2011, Vera was 68 and had been attending estate sales in a 4-state area for nearly 30 years. She had developed over that time a reputation in a small circle: textile conservators, museum curators, a few dealers who called her occasionally when they needed to know something they didn't know, and also a reputation, quieter and less comfortable, among the estate sale operators in Randolph County and surrounding counties. A vague awareness that Vera Stinson sometimes bought things at sales that turned out to be worth considerably more than the price. An awareness that most people in that position preferred not to examine too closely. Cal Prentice had stopped running sales in 2004. The business had passed to a woman named Joanna Farrell, who was 44 in 2011 and had Cal's manner and Cal's clipboard and Cal's same underlying method, which was to move efficiently through the contents of a life and arrive at a number and stand behind it. Joanna Farrell called Vera in April of 2011. She called because she had an estate coming up, the property of a retired home economics teacher named Stella Bauer, who had died at 85, and the family had mentioned that there was a sewing room that none of them could assess. Someone, Joanna didn't say who, had given her Vera's name. Vera listened to the description and said she'd come and look. She drove out to the Bauer property on a Wednesday and walked through the sewing room in 40 minutes. Stella Bauer had been a different kind of collector than Bertie Krause, more systematic, more documented, with a teacher's instinct for categorization. What the room held was substantial. Vera came out and found Joanna Farrell on the porch. "What do you think?" Vera said, "I think you should have it properly appraised before you price it." "Joanna's why I called you." Vera said, "I'm not an appraiser, I'm a conservator. If you want an appraiser, I can give you a name." Joanna looked at her for a moment. "What would you pay for it?" Vera said, "That's not a question I'm going to answer." There was a silence. Joanna looked at her clipboard and then at the house and then at Vera. "The family needs this settled by the end of the month," she said. Vera said, "Call the appraiser this week. Her name is Driscoll. She's in St. Louis. She can be here by Friday if you tell her what you have." The appraiser came. The contents of Stella Bauer's sewing room were appraised at $14,000, which was $14,000 more than Joanna had been ready to write in the shopper, and the family sold them through a specialist auction in Chicago and received $11,200 after commission, which was $11,200 more than they would have received if Vera had answered Joanna's question differently on a Wednesday afternoon in April. Joanna called Vera after the sale closed. She said, "You could have bought all of that yourself for whatever I priced it at." Vera said, "I know." "Why didn't you?" Vera said, "Because knowing what something is worth is not the same thing as being entitled to it at someone else's ignorance. Those are different things." There was a long pause. Dollars. Then Joanna said, I've been thinking about the cruise sale. Cal told me about it years ago. Dollars. I know he did. Dollars. Joanna said you knew what was in that cabinet. Dollars. Vera said I had a pretty good idea. Dollars. Was that right? Dollars. Vera didn't answer immediately. She held the question the way she held a piece she was trying to understand, turning it over, looking at the structure of it. Then she said, Cal listed what he saw. I paid for what I knew. The distance between those two things is exactly as wide as the distance between seeing and understanding. I don't know how to call that wrong without calling knowledge itself wrong. Dollars. Joanna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'd like to learn how to see what you see. Dollars. Vera said, that's a different conversation. Come by on Saturday. Dollars. Joanna came on Saturday. She came the following Saturday. She came most Saturdays through the winter of 2011 and into 2012. What happened on those Saturdays was not a class. It was the slower thing, Dollars. The thing that Vera's father had done with her at a kitchen table in Chester, Dollars, which was the transmission of a way of attention from one person to another through the handling of actual objects and the practice of looking at them carefully enough to see what they were. Dollars. Joanna Farrell did not become Vera Stinson. That was not the point and was not possible. But she became, over those months, Dollars, a person who could walk into a sewing room and understand that she might not understand what she was looking at, which is the first and most important thing. She started calling appraisers when the room warranted it, Dollars. She started looking at how things had been stored as evidence of who had owned them. She started asking questions that she hadn't known to ask. Dollars. Let me tell you about the last sale Vera attended in person, because the story ends there, and it ends the way the best stories end, which is with something that hasn't happened yet. Dollars. It was October of 2018. Vera was 75 and had been having trouble with her back for 2 years and had driven herself to a sale in Franklin County, Missouri, 3 hours from Chester, because a conservator she trusted had called and said there was something she should see. Dollars. The sale was at a farmhouse outside Washington, Missouri, the estate of a woman named Ilse Brandt, who had come to the United States from Germany in 1952 and who had worked for 20 years as an embroiderer for a liturgical textile firm in St. Louis before retiring to the farmhouse. The firm had closed in 1991. Most of what it had produced was in churches across the Midwest. Ilse had kept her tools. Dollars. Lena was with her. They walked into the workroom together, and Vera stood in front of the wall cabinet for 5 minutes without speaking. Dollars. Lena looked at the cabinet. She understood most of what she was seeing and recognized that there were things she didn't understand, which was a different experience than the one Cal Prentice had had in Bertie Krause's sewing room 24 years earlier, because Lena knew enough to know what she was missing. Dollars. Vera said, you see the goldwork frames on the second shelf? Dollars. Lena said she did. Dollars. The ones on the left side. Dollars. Lena looked at them. She looked at the construction. She looked at the joinery. She looked at her mother. Dollars. Vera said, those are not American. Look at the corner hardware. Dollars. Lena looked at the hardware. She looked at the mark on the inner edge of the nearest frame. She looked at her mother. Dollars. Vera, I've seen that mark in a catalog from 1929. I've never seen it on an actual piece. Dollars. They stood there for a moment. Dollars. Lena said, what do you want to do? Dollars. Vera said, I want to buy the frames and the goldwork tools and the metal thread assortment in the top drawer, and I want to make sure the rest of this goes to someone who knows what it is. Dollars. Lena said, Joanna has a contact at a specialist house in Chicago. Dollars. Vera said, call her. Dollars. Lena called Joanna from the parking lot while Vera went back inside. The frames and the tools and the thread assortment were already priced, conservatively but not insultingly, because the appraiser Joanna had recommended to the family's auctioneer had been there the week before and had done her job. Vera paid $430 for the lot. The remainder of the workroom sold through the Chicago house the following spring for $9,000, which went to Ilse Brandt's daughter in Jefferson City, who had not known and who called Lena afterward and cried, not entirely because of the money. Vera drove back to Chester with the frames wrapped in cloth on the back seat, the same kind of careful wrapping she'd used for Bertie Cruz's thimbles 24 years earlier. She drove 3 hours in the dark and got home after midnight and set the frames on her work table and looked at them under the lamp for a while before she went to bed. Lena called the next morning and asked how she was feeling. Vera said she was fine. Lena said, you going to use them or keep them? Vera said both. Lena laughed. Vera said, your grandfather would have said they were just frozen accuracy waiting for someone who understood what they were for. Lena said, I know. There was a pause, then Lena said, Mom, I've been thinking about something. Vera said, what? Lena said, there's a whole generation of workrooms out there. Women who were professional embroiderers and dressmakers and lace makers, their families have no idea what they have. The auctioneers price it like rummage. The tools end up in lots with kitchen gadgets and broken appliances, and the people who would know what they are, she stopped. Vera said, are getting old. Lena said, yeah. Vera said, what are you thinking? Lena said, I think someone should write it down. Vera sat in her kitchen with her coffee in the same chair where she had sat in 1994 and thought about Bertie Cruz, and about August, and about the Premax scissors that were still in their leather wallet in the cabinet by the work table, and about the Austrian transfer set that Lena had taken with her when she moved to Evansville, because she used it in her conservation work and because Vera had wanted it to keep being used. She thought about what it meant for a woman to keep silk thread pliable for 50 years in a drawer in a farmhouse in Randolph County and leave it to a son in Memphis who saw a room full of old stuff. She said, you'd need photographs, real ones, with proper light, and you'd need access to the institutional collections. I know a curator in Philadelphia. Vera said, I know her too. Lena said, so you think it's worth doing? Vera said, I think it's the thing that should have been done before either of us was born. They started the following year. It took 3 years, and it was not a book in any commercial sense. It was a field reference, spiral-bound, copied and distributed through textile conservation networks and estate sale professional associations and the Embroiderers Guild chapters in 8 states. It had no publisher. It ran to 188 pages and included photographs of makers' marks and manufacturing details, and the specific visual indicators that allowed someone willing to look carefully to distinguish a professional tool from a domestic one, a pre-war piece from a post-war one, a complete set from a scattered one. Joanna Farrell helped get it into the hands of every estate sale operator and auctioneer she knew in Illinois and Indiana and Missouri. She wrote a note to go with each copy that said it was the guide she wished she'd had in 2011, written by a woman who had spent her life knowing things that most people walked past, and that the least any of them could do was learn enough to stop walking past them. The guide is still in circulation. Lena has revised it once since Vera's death in 2021, adding sections on the tools of specific trades that had nearly vanished: professional lace makers, whitework specialists, ecclesiastical embroiderers, the craftswoman of the precision textile trades whose workrooms were being cleared out every year by families with no framework for understanding what they were inheriting. The second edition runs to 240 pages. It is still spiral-bound. On the cover below the title, Lena added a line. It reads, for Bertie Cruz, who kept the accuracy intact until someone came along who knew what it was for. The Austrian transfer set is in Lena's workroom in Evansville. She uses it. The Premax scissors are there too, still in the original wallet, still cutting the way they were made to cut, which is to say cleanly and without pulling, the way a thing cuts when it was made by someone who understood that the quality of a cut is the whole point of a blade. And Lena's daughter, who is 22 years old and studying materials conservation at a university in Ohio, and who spent last summer in her mother's workroom learning to read maker's marks, the way August Stinson taught Vera to read them 40 years ago in a kitchen in Chester. Asked her mother last summer what she thought the field guide would look like in another 20 years. Lena said she didn't know. She said the trades keep disappearing and the tools keep ending up in estate sales, priced by people who are doing their best with what they can see, and the distance between what things are worth and what they appear to be worth keeps being exactly as wide as the distance between looking and understanding. Her daughter thought about that. Then she said, someone should map it, all the regional tool traditions, the manufacturers, the trade networks. A database people could actually search. Lena looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, come by on Saturday. I keep thinking about the 8 minutes. That's how long Cal Prentice spent in Bertie Krause's sewing room before he wrote $80 in his notebook and moved on. 8 minutes for a room that held $22,000 worth of precision tools that a woman had spent 50 years collecting and caring for. 8 minutes, and then a number that felt right, and then a line in a weekly shopper that most people skipped. I don't say that to make Cal the villain of the story. He wasn't. He was a competent man doing his job the way his job had taught him to do it, which was to move quickly and arrive at a number and stand behind it. The failure wasn't moral. It was the failure of not knowing, and not knowing that he didn't know, which is a different thing entirely, and one that I think most of us are more familiar with than we'd like to admit. What Vera had that Cal didn't wasn't luck. It wasn't an insider advantage or a trick. It was 40 years of paying attention to something that almost nobody else in Randolph County thought was worth paying attention to. She had read catalogs that nobody else bothered to find. She had written letters to curators who were surprised to hear from someone in southern Illinois. She had handled thousands of objects carefully and asked what they were and remembered the answers. That's the whole of it. There's no mystery in how she knew what she knew. The only mystery is how rarely we're willing to do the quiet, unglamorous work of actually learning something deeply enough to see it clearly. And then there's what she did with what she knew. That's the part I find myself returning to most. She could have answered Joanna Farrell's question. What would you pay for it? She knew exactly what she would have paid and why, and it would have been a legal transaction and a profitable one, and nobody could have called it wrong by any rule the estate sale system recognizes. She didn't answer it. She gave Joanna the appraiser's name instead, and $14,000 went to a family that had no idea it existed, and Joanna Farrell started coming to Vera's house on Saturdays and learning how to see. That's not sainthood, that's not some abstract moral principle. That's a person who understood that knowing something valuable creates a responsibility that doesn't disappear just because the system doesn't require you to honor it. Vera had been on the other side of that equation in 1994, and she'd made a different choice then, and I think she'd spent some years sitting with what that meant. By 2011, she knew the answer she wanted to give. What I keep coming back to is the transmission. August to Vera to Lena's daughter, who is 22 years old and talking about building a database. None of that happens without the stubbornness to keep going when the thing you're learning has no obvious reward. Vera restored old linens in a south-facing room on a gravel road for 22 years before she walked into Bertie Krause's sewing room. That's not a shortcut story. That's a long, quiet, unglamorous accumulation of something that eventually became the ability to see what no one else in the room could see. Dollars. The tools are still there. The Austrian transfer set is in Lena's workroom. The Premax scissors still cut cleanly. Bertie Krause kept them that way for 50 years, which means she understood something about the relationship between care and permanence that I find genuinely moving. She kept the accuracy intact, as Lena wrote on the cover of the field guide, until someone came along who knew what it was for. Dollars. I think that's what knowledge actually is, when it's working the way it's supposed to. Not leverage, not an advantage you hold over people who don't have it, a kind of custodianship. You carry it carefully, you use it honestly, and when the time comes, you hand it to someone who will do the same. Dollars. The field guide runs to 240 pages now. It's spiral-bound. It has no publisher. It is, by most measures, an invisible thing. Dollars. It is also the reason that somewhere in Illinois or Indiana or Missouri right now, a locked cabinet in a dead woman's back room is going to be opened by someone who knows enough to know what they're looking at. Dollars. That's what $80 bought in Randolph County in 1994. Not a sewing room, not $22,000. True proof that what you spend your life learning is the only thing that doesn't lose value when you're not looking.